Welcome to today's webinar, Luck Favors Prepared, Getting a Start on Your EPA Brownfields Grant Application, hosted by NJIT Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities, or NJIT TAB. We're excited to have you all here, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to spend it with us, getting a head start on your EPA Brownfield Grant applications. My name is Fatima Matos, and I'm the Events Coordinator here at NJIT's Center for Community Systems. Emu Marcus, our Manager for Marketing and Engagement, and I will be helping to facilitate today's webinar. Before we get started, I first want to go over some ground rules. 1. This session will be recorded. All recordings and presentations shown today will be available on our website at www.njit.edu/tab. 2. While you are muted, you can utilize the chat feature for comments and to check in with other participants. As a warm-up, let us know in the chat where you're logging in from today. Do you have any summer plans you're looking forward to? I'm in New Jersey, and I'm a big fan of visiting some of our local lakes during the summer. Call me the Lady of the Lake if you'd like. As we wait to hear about your summer plans, let's review other ways you can participate. The Q&A module is reserved for questions to our speaker and moderator. You can upvote questions posed by others to boost them in the queue. Following the presentation, there will be some time dedicated to any questions or comments which have not been addressed during the talk. And at that time, those who have asked questions via the Q&A module will receive messages in the chat to verify if you'd like to ask your question directly, or may just verbally call upon you. At that time, Mimi and I will allow you to unmute yourself to ask your question. To review, type questions in the Q&A video and comments in the chat video. If there's a question that can't be answered today, feel free to visit our LinkedIn event page for today's webinar, where we can connect and answer those questions for you. Feel free to also engage further in discussion there as well. I'm sure there are attendees here today that have a vast wealth of knowledge on different areas of brownfield redevelopment. Continue the conversation and learning after today's webinar. Let's see what people have said about their summer plans. I've seen some folks from South Carolina as well. Looking forward to reading by the local pool. Love that as well. My apartment, I just moved into an apartment with a pool, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. No plans or grant writers. I get it. It's a lot of work, and I'm glad that you're here. Maybe if you prepare enough and more in advance, you'd have some time to do some things, and I hope you get to do that. Not, I know grant writing is its own reward. The North Carolina folks. Great, thank you for being here today. Rule number 4, if you run into any technical issues during today's webinar, if you know of any attendees that are having any trouble accessing the webinar, feel free to email me at fm392@njit.edu. I'll be monitoring my email and will provide technical assistance as needed. 5, lastly, at the end of this webinar, you'll be directed to a feedback survey. Our goal is to serve brownfield communities to the best of our ability. We would love to hear your thoughts so that we can provide resources and materials that align with your goals and needs. If you have an idea for a future webinar regarding a topic you're interested in, feel free to provide that feedback as well. We want to create content that works for you. So to review, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see where you could ask questions, share your thoughts, or if you'd like to have some captions, as well as live translation, it's over in our captions button as well. Now, with those rules out of the way, we can begin. It's my pleasure to introduce a man who possesses 30 years of professional experience in the environmental and infrastructure field in both the public and private sectors. Sean Vroom, Director for NJIT's Center for Community Systems. During his career, he has managed millions of dollars worth of projects, studies, and programs. In fact, in the past 3 years, Mr. Vroom has assisted numerous EPA brownfield applicants totaling over $10 million in grant awards. Now, that kind of money can buy you a lot of trips to the lake. I know that for sure. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Great. Thank you, Fatima, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, and happy Juneteenth. I do hope you find it informative and that it inspires those of you planning to apply for an EPA Brownfields grant to start the process as early as possible. So, like the title says, luck favors the prepared. So before we jump in, I just want to give you an overview of what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to go over, basically, we want to have a good foundation. What are the EPA grants? Brownfield grants that are available, typically available year to year. What is the grant solicitation cycle? We want to talk about, we're going to talk about early application tasks, which include community engagement, data gathering, planning efforts, geographic and target areas, as well as brownfield identification. We're also going to cover submission setup related to SAMs and Grants.gov. And we're also going to quickly go through some common mistakes that you can that we've seen applicants make over the years, so that you can have that kind of in front of you as you embark on writing this application. It'll help you avoid some of the more common pitfalls. So to set the foundation for today's presentation, it's always helpful to know what types of brownfield grants EPA offers. And obviously it's what you're going to be preparing for. So EPA brownfield grants are available on an annual basis, and they include brownfields multi-purpose grants, which provide funding to conduct a range of eligible planning, assessment, and cleanup activities at one or more brownfield sites in numerous target areas. There's also the brownfield assessment grants. There's several types of those. There's the community-wide, there's coalition assessment grants, and they provide funding for brownfield inventories, planning, environmental assessment, and community outreach. Then there's the brownfield revolving loan fund grants, which provide funding to capitalize loans that are used for cleanup of brownfields. And then finally, there's the brownfield cleanup grants, and self-explanatory, they provide funding to carry out cleanup activities at brownfield sites by the applicant. So just to make everybody aware of who is eligible for these EPA brownfields grants, you have to be either a state, a county, a local, or tribal government, or a nonprofit to be eligible. So as I mentioned before, EPA solicits these grants on an annual basis. The typical solicitation cycle starts with the request for applications, or RFA, being released in early fall. Typically, it's usually the first week or two of September. The application submission date is approximately 6 weeks after that. Applications EPA announces once those are submitted, the applications are then reviewed by EPA, and then EPA announces those successful applicants the following spring. And finally, the funding becomes available to the grantee in late summer. So it's roughly 1 year from the request for applications to the grant funds being available to the successful applicant. So why is starting early important in preparing a competitive application? Well, first, as I mentioned earlier, there are roughly 6 weeks from the request for applications to the submission date, and that's not a lot of time. And it's usually during the fall, which is typically a very busy time of the year for most people. Second, it builds a solid planning foundation or continues existing planning efforts. In past years, EPA has put much more emphasis on the planning associated with the project. And although some planning activities are eligible under these grants, most successful applicants began the planning process well in advance of applying. So regardless of the funding sources you may be pursuing, it's always recommended that projects be based on sound planning practices. Third, it provides time to address EPA application emphasis areas. Again, you only have 6 weeks to prepare the application, and EPA emphasis areas may change from the previous year. So having certain tasks completed prior to the request for applications gives you more time during the 6 weeks window to focus on the new emphasis area criteria. And then lastly, it allows for more involved technical assistance. So as I mentioned, or I should have mentioned earlier, is that NJIT TAB is a free resource to communities, and part of the services we do provide includes grant application critiques. So instead of you sending us your application just before the submission, you can send it earlier, and we can provide you assistance throughout its preparation, and that'll give you enough time to incorporate any feedback we might give you. So for all the EPA Brownfield grants, the narrative ranking criteria is broken down into 4 major sections. Section 1 includes the project area description and plans for revitalization. Section 2 includes community need and community engagement. Section 3 includes task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. And Section 4 includes programmatic capability and past performance. So for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to focus on activities associated with the criteria within sections 1 and 2 of the application narrative that can be started early. These sections are essentially the essay contest sections where you make your case for community need and highlight community involvement. Sections 3 and 4 of the application narrative are more of pro forma in nature, where you basically, the questions asked and you provide the information. So the tasks that you can begin early serve as the basis in the development of your project outline. Your project outline serves as a guide throughout the brownfields redevelopment process, which is illustrated on this slide. It's obviously something that is developed during the early planning stages of that process, particularly prior to applying for an EPA Brownfield grant. This outline may vary slightly from project to project, but they are all basically similar and will serve as your brownfields redevelopment roadmap, assisting you in gauging progress and strategizing where to bring resources, both technical and funding, to bear during the project's lifetime. It's also critical in maintaining project continuity, as brownfield projects typically take a bit longer than the average real estate redevelopment project, and staff and elected officials come and go. So, having that continuity certainly serves you well in the lifetime of this project. I should also mention that your project outline will also serve as the basis for your EPA project work plan should you be awarded a brownfields grant. So the tasks that we're going to focus on that provide the basis for the first 2 narrative criteria sections include, as I mentioned earlier, community engagement, demographic and health data collection, priority brownfield site information, identification of relevant planning efforts and documentation, geographic and target area identification, and brownfields identification and prioritization. So a critical element of a competitive EPA Brownfield grant application is the development of an inclusive and effective community engagement plan. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have all the tasks associated with community engagement completed prior to submission, but you can start thinking about what your engagement plan will look like and start the outreach process. One example of where these activities can be initiated is the identification and prioritization of the priority brownfield sites you will highlight in your application. Having the community play a part in the identification of these sites shows community support and consideration for your project and helps define what the overall goals are and how they meet the community's needs. You may have already conducted community engagement activities that support this. You should identify and document those activities and make sure that the community engagement plan you include in your application incorporates them as well. So brownfield partnerships. There are several typical partners involved in brownfields redevelopment. For instance, agencies of the federal government, such as US EPA, provide both funding assistance and expertise. Territorial, environmental, and economic development agencies also bring important resources to the brownfields redevelopment process. Real estate professionals can help communities better understand the realities of the real estate market and can suggest various incentives that would help make local brownfields redevelopment projects economically viable. A public-private partnership between a local government and a real estate developer is an effective collaboration for brownfields redevelopment, especially in weak market areas. A university or college may be a valuable partner in brownfields redevelopment. Professors, researchers, and graduate students may provide insight and expertise on brownfields-related topics. Some universities and colleges host design studios in which students work on real-world redevelopment projects. So that can be a really good asset to be able to bring to the table. Other typical partners include bankers and lenders, Chamber of Commerce and business owners, neighborhood associations and other community groups, nonprofits, environmental consultants, as well as environmental justice organization. But in some circumstances, you're going to need to go beyond kind of the usual suspects. So there are other groups and organizations that can add value to your brownfields redevelopment team. They can offer unique and important resources. For instance, local artists and cultural institutions can be great partners in bringing attention to brownfield sites, suggesting creative ways to engage the community, and envisioning the property's reuse, as well as helping be more creative in the marketing aspect of those particular sites. So why are partnerships important? Brownfields redevelopment is a team sport, and partners bring resources and specialized knowledge. They foster communication and collaboration, and they build bridges between relevant stakeholders. They help access funding, especially non-traditional funding sources. They support marketing efforts. They can help overcome complex brownfield issues. They can help with community engagement, and they can foster creative end uses for these sites. The second element of a competitive application that should be embarked upon early is demographic and health data, which is essentially the data that establishes community need. So why is community need data critical to writing a competitive application? Well, first, it quantifies community needs and challenges. A strong application doesn't just make statements without the data to support the claims, including data such as poverty rates, unemployment, loss of tax base, population decline, as well as health statistics such as cancer rates, asthma rates, infant mortality, and heart disease. Comparative data such as target area versus county, state, or national rates can be very compelling, and again is critical to establishing community need. Second, it supports the community story. A strong brownfields application always tells a compelling story, and that story is comprised of three broad elements. First, you're going to outline the problem and challenges faced by the community. Then you're going to outline how you're going to remedy those problems or challenges. And finally, you're going to outline what the results will be or what those outcomes will be. So as I stated earlier, you're going to need to quantify and confirm those needs to support your story. And finally, it helps identify project goals by identifying and supporting community needs and challenges, which should be the things you address in your project outcomes. So, common data sources. There's several sources of data that you should consider to identify and support your target area. I won't go through all of the ones that I have listed on this slide, but I would like to mention three that are very useful for high-level identification of areas that suffer a disproportionate level of environmental burden. And they are EPA's EJ screen, EPA EnviroFacts, and then CJES, which stands for Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. So these tools are fairly user-friendly, and the advantage of them is that they draw on multiple sources of data to highlight those underserved communities. And I certainly recommend checking them out in the course of you preparing this application that you're going to submit to EPA. So on this slide, I've provided you with a list of some data sources along with their URLs so that you can have a good place to start in collecting and gathering your data. Again, I'm not going to go through this entire list, but I did want to point out, we already went over the three I had to emphasize, sorry. Again, EnviroFacts, EJ Screen, and CJES. Again, they gather from multiple data sources, and it's a really good first stop in identifying those target areas for your application. So identification of relevant planning efforts and documentation. Another element of a grant application is the identification of relevant planning efforts and documentation. As I mentioned earlier, EPA places much emphasis on the planning related to these brownfield application projects. The reason for this is that a project that's based on solid planning has a greater chance of success, and that's what EPA wants to see. Good planning is a great indicator of community support and commitment to taking projects through to redevelopment. So it's not only important in the eyes of EPA, but developers want to see that they will have minimal obstacles in developing a property. And for any developer, time is money and a huge factor in whether a project is financially viable or not. Some plans that you should consider when you develop your brownfields application include target area specific redevelopment plans. You want to make sure that you take a look at local master plans, as well as zoning and any transportation plans that may have projects in them that may have a bearing on your target areas. So you're also, you want to make sure that those plans relate to your proposed project. You don't want to just list them for the sake of listing them. They have to have relevance. In some cases, there may not be relevant plans like the ones that I had just mentioned, that they may not be available. However, any stakeholder or community engagement findings would be considered planning to support a project. Again, EPA doesn't want to see projects that just fall out of the sky. So as I mentioned earlier, for this presentation, I'm going to highlight geographic and target areas, supporting data and partnerships, elements of a brownfields project that must be addressed early on, not only to serve as the basis for the project redevelopment roadmap, but to tee up for funding resources such as EPA's brownfield grants, as all the EPA brownfield grants require that you address them in the application. So I'll begin with explaining what a geographic area is in comparison to a target area. So in simple terms, it's the area that you're going to conduct eligible activities with your grant funds. So your geographic boundary should include an area that suffers from brownfield challenges and impacts that you can quantify with data. It can include the applicant, and in some cases, a coalition member's jurisdictional or service area boundaries or a sub area of those boundaries. Regardless of the area selected, it should make sense in terms of your overall project plan and goals. You also want to make sure that you specifically describe the boundaries of your geographic area using roadways, rail lines, rivers, so on and so forth. You have to keep in mind that at least one of your EPA, and probably more than one of your EPA grant application reviewers, is not going to be familiar with your area. So you need to make it as clear to them as possible what areas you're focusing on. So now that you have hopefully have a good idea what a geographic area is, I'll discuss what the target area is and what the difference between it and a geographic area is. A target area is basically an area that's within your geographic area that has some type of cohesive element that distinguishes it. So an example would be a downtown district, the community gateway, a waterfront area, an industrial district, or maybe it's a corridor like a rail or highway. They also typically have common characteristics such as being communities that are environmental justice, underserved, aging, and or minority, and therefore typically suffer from a lack of affordable housing. They contain food deserts. There's a lack of investment in these areas. They have high unemployment. They lack services, and so on and so forth, everything that you would associate with an underserved community. So why is it important to delineate a target area? Well, first, it serves as the foundation for a comprehensive planning approach. It shows that some forethought has gone into the brownfields project, and that reassures EPA that a project has a higher probability for success. And that's the kind of project EPA wants to invest with its brownfields grants. Second, it helps identify priority brownfields, which is a requirement of EPA brownfields grant applications. In your EPA brownfield grant, you are going to highlight those priority brownfield sites that best make your project case by emphasizing community needs and having the characteristics to potentially meet your project goals. It also enables you to identify sites that can be assembled to meet the needs for larger redevelopment types. Third, it helps focus redevelopment scenarios that meet the needs of the community. Having a target area identified with common community needs will make it easier to determine what type of redevelopment best serves the community. It's a common mistake made by many grant applicants. The needs don't match the redevelopment plan. So, an example would be if the needs are affordable housing, but somehow along the way, the application morphs into, there's now the goals are to achieve open space. So you want to make sure that those two are in sync. And lastly, it helps leverage funding. By having a target area with identified specific needs, it makes it easier to identify what funding sources could be pursued to finance a project, and has laid the foundation for applying for those funding resources. So similarly to the geographic area, when you apply for an EPA Brownfields grant, again, it's critical to be specific when describing the boundaries of your target area. And as as I mentioned earlier, there's a list of applicable census tracts in the target area that you can gather data on and include. So don't just say the northeast quadrant of the city or town or the XYZ neighborhood. Describe the exact boundaries. Again, streets, rail line, rivers, so on and so forth. So what's the role of data in selecting a target area? So, so how does it really, play into the determination and description of your brownfield priority sites? Well, for starters, it's critical in establishing community need. Whenever possible, you want to back up any statements you make in describing your community's challenges with data. If you make the statement about declining population, high unemployment, or high incidence of disease, you want to cite census and health data sources to support that claim. It supports project goals, but by defining the community needs, and therefore informs potential redevelopment types. Needs should match project goals. It also plays a role in defining the exact boundaries of your target area to have more competitive EPA Brownfields grant, to have a more competitive EPA Brownfields grant application. So what I mean by that is if extending the boundary of your target area would enable you to include a census tract that the data associated with that makes for a stronger case for community needs. Again, employment, health risks, populations at risk, lack of services, then you'd be wise to make that adjustment. Adjusting the target area boundary may also enable you to include brownfield sites that would make strong candidates for priority sites in your application. Remember that the sections of EPA's brownfield grants that this information would be included is where you want to show your community in the worst light possible. I know that most applicants want to focus on the better parts of your community, but for the purposes of the EPA grants, you want just the opposite. You want to show them in the most impoverished light possible to make your case. So the last element I want to discuss is brownfield identification and prioritization. Choosing the best sites to include in your application can make or break your brownfield grant application. So why is it so important? Well, first, it shows, again, a comprehensive approach and that you have given careful thought to your project approach. Second, it makes the best case for your application story. You want to choose sites that have the best associated data to make your case. And third, it focuses project goals. And by that, I mean, if your project goal is open and green space, you want to have selected sites that can accommodate this type of reuse and is supported by consistent planning. So when you do select your sites, some of the things you want to think about is there an existing brownfield inventory, and are you drawing your sites from that inventory? Is the site located within your target area or project emphasis area, such as a downtown or gateway? Does the site meet EPA's definition of a brownfield? Confirm with the EPA regional office that your site is eligible. That's extremely important. Does the data associated with your priority sites highlight your community's challenges to the greatest extent possible? And do your priority sites have the potential to meet project goals? Again, if your project goals are for open space or residential, make sure that the sites can accommodate that type of reuse. So, it would matter what size and location, so on and so forth. So, priority brownfield site information. In considering what priority sites have the potential to meet your project's goal, you want to make sure that your sites meet the definition of a brownfield. You want to know what the ownership situation is on that site. For certain grants, you have to have access to the sites. If you own them, it's easier to access. If not, you have to get access to that site. Past site uses, you want to know what the past, if there's any known contamination on the site. I mean, a lot of these grants, you're going to determine that, but any information you have prior or knowledge of contamination is helpful. You want to know if there's any structures on that site. Are there wetlands on that site? Is it within a flood plain? Is the site secured, or is there no, is it fenced? If not fenced, do illicit activities occur on this site, such as illegal dumping, squatting? And what available infrastructure is there for that site? Is there gas? Is there electric? Is there Wi-Fi? What kind of, is there rail access? Does it have access to a major arterial roadway? These are things that you want to know when you decide which sites are your priorities. So that kind of covers everything that's related to the grant narrative application. And these are again, they're the tasks that you can begin early. So in addition to that, there's some administrative tasks that must be done early on as well. There's a process to make sure that your account is set up in SAM.gov so that you can actually submit your grant application to the EPA. And this needs to be done in a certain order. It's going to entail signing up at SAM.gov, obtaining your unique entity identifier or UEI, and then using the UEI to submit the application and forms through Grants.gov. So essentially what you do is you get an active account through SAMs.gov, you register your entity through SAMs.gov, are issued your UEI through SAMs.gov, and that basically tees you up to be ready to apply through Grants.gov. So here's a little more detail on the requirements of some common pitfalls. And please note that this is in the order of how it should be completed. If you've already done this for other programs and you already have a UEI, you want to check this anyway to make sure that your account is active throughout the grant submission deadline. The past couple of years, this has been right before Thanksgiving, the deadline for the Brownfield grant submission. So if it expires this summer, you're going to want to make sure that you reactivate it as it needs to be reactivated annually. You're not allowed to use somebody else's UEI, so you have to make sure that you get one issued for your entity. And you have to keep in mind that you have to be the authorized original representative to submit the application through Grants.gov, and you need to know the password. So you want to make sure that you have all this information at hand prior to going into a solicitation cycle. So here's what it looks like when you get started registering your organization in SAMs.gov. Before you sit down to do this, you want to look at the checklist that I've provided on this slide and gather all this information that you're going to need for this. It's a lot of information to gather. For example, you just don't input your address. You need certain documents to provide proof that it is in fact your address. It might take you a little bit to gather all this material, and you don't want to be scrambling to do this the day it's due. So again, start now. It's also going to give you the option to do a UEI only without registration, but we certainly don't want you to do this if you intend on applying for a grant. So once the account becomes active, which is roughly 2 weeks, sometimes it's a little bit longer, you will receive a unique entity identifier. If you haven't done this prior, you'll get that UEI for your organization. This is how Grants.gov will identify your organization. You can now apply for grants in Grants.gov. The point of contact manages the online account and manages the activities in Grants.gov. You can assign different roles in SAMs.gov. The person who will submit the application in Grants.gov is called the Authorized Organization Representative, or AOR. This is also the person that would be informed should there be any errors in the application. So, you're allowed to fix the error and resubmit before the deadline, which is another reason why you want to get this done early. So now, for those of you that would be applying for a UEI, and now that you've been issued it after going through SAMs.gov, you can sign up for Grants.gov. And it basically, once you sign into Grants.gov, it'll repopulate. It carries the information over from SAMs.gov once you begin the registration process. So you're going to submit your application in the Grants.gov workspace. In addition to the project narrative, you're also going to need to fill out some forms that I have listed on the slide, and I'll go into more detail. These are the forms you're going to need. First is the SF 424 application for federal assistance. And this is basically general information about your organization, including the UEI that you receive from SAM.gov, your org name and address, contact information, and what grant you're applying for. There's some other details on here that you might need to look up, like congressional districts, and if this project is subject to state review. Don't wait until the last minute to pull this together. The next form is your SF 424A, which is a detailed information form on your budget, which you might not be able to answer immediately if you don't have a good handle on the scope of your proposal or the cost estimates associated with it. Something to note, the name of this form is budget information for non-construction programs, but there may be things associated with your brownfield project that are considered construction to the federal government, like asbestos abatement or excavation. You don't need a separate form for these activities. There's a construction line item on this form. Then you have Form 5700-54. Which is basically your key contact. So the contact information for the person submitting the application, the contact information for the payee, the administrative contact, and the project manager. This one's a pretty straightforward form. And then lastly, you have EPA Form 4700-4, which is basically, it's a screen that determines the eligibility of your organization to receive federal funds. So on this form, you would need to list pending lawsuits and administrative complaints related to, discrimination. So again, you're gonna, if that is an issue for you, you're gonna need to have these forms ready, that information ready at hand before you fill out the form and submit it. So with all EPA brownfield grant applications, a state letter is required for all grant types. For multi-purpose assessment and RLF. It's just basically an acknowledgement letter from the state saying that they're aware that you're applying for the grant. For a cleanup grant, it's a little bit more in depth. The EPA is asking the state to verify that the site is in fact ready for cleanup. So that would mean going back and looking at all the work that's been done, reviewing those reports to make sure that no other investigation work needs to be done. And this will take a little bit of lead time for the state to do that. So the earlier you get it into them, the better. You wouldn't need two letters in this state. I mean, in this circumstance, if you were going for a cleanup grant, because if you go for the cleanup grant and you get the verification that it's ready for cleanup, that basically also serves as an acknowledgement that they know you're applying for the grant. So regarding cleanup grants, there's another unique requirement that's community notification and outreach along with your ABCA or analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives. This is where you'll inform the community of what your plan is for the cleanup. So you want to think about the lead time that you're going to need for this. You're going to need to set the date for that outreach event, and it needs to be at least 14 days prior to the submission of your cleanup application. You're going to need to give the public the opportunity to review your plan and make comments on it. And you need to compile those comments as well as any responses to those comments. So of course, all this needs to be documented in your application submission. And so it's going to include, you're going to need to submit a copy of the draft ABCA, a copy of the newspaper ad or the equivalent that demonstrates solicitation for comments on the application, and that notification to the public occurred at least 14 calendar days before the application was submitted to EPA. An equivalent method may include, for example, a dated image of the website or copy of the listserv message used to notify the public. You're going to need to include the comments or some summary of the comments that you receive from the public. You're also going to have to document the applicant's response to those public comments. Any meeting notes or summary from the public meetings should be included, as well as the meeting sign-in sheet and the participant list. So it's a little bit more involved with the cleanup grant, but certainly nothing that's insurmountable, but something that should be tackled and scheduled early, like I said, at a minimum of 14 days prior to the submission of your cleanup grant application. So again, that's the narrative. I focused on the narrative in the beginning, then we went to the administrative end of it. We're going to kind of go back to the narrative again. I want to talk to you a little bit about before we get common brownfield application mistakes. But before we do that, I just want to remind all of you that if you have any questions on what I've covered so far, please enter it into the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screens, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. So to help make writing your grant narrative more productive, I thought I'd go through some of the common mistakes we see applicants consistently make when writing your grants. And again, keep in mind that these are based on past guidelines that were issued. There may be some nuance from year to year, but for the most part, what I'm going to cover here is consistent, or has been consistent, from year to year in the solicitations. So first up is like I said, there's 4 main sections to the grant application narrative. Section 1 is the project area description and plans for revitalization, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. This presentation will be made available. You can always print this out, have this in front of you when you're preparing your grant application. If you have any questions or you want us to go into more depth about what I'm kind of listing here, you can certainly reach out to us and we'll provide you with that assistance. I mean, we do grant critiques for free, but it doesn't have to be a one-off where we just review your grant critique. If you have questions along the way on certain sections, feel free to pick up the phone and call us as many times as you like. So back to section 1, the target area and brownfields, the overview of brownfield challenges and description of the target area. Basically, the major issue here is that the applicant doesn't describe the geographic area or target area boundaries adequately. Like I said, use roads, rivers, whatever you can do to make somebody who's completely unfamiliar with the area that you're talking about familiar and feel like they have a good handle on where you're focusing. Make sure you do that. The applicant confuses geographic area with target area. As I went through earlier, the geographic area is that larger area that you can apply the funding of your grant, but your target area is located within that geographic area, and that is the one that you focus on with your grant applications. Next section is description of the priority brownfield sites. Some of the common mistakes here is that the applicant doesn't provide details of priority sites. For example, structures, slab. Is there a slab? Is it secured? Are there wetlands? Is it overgrown? Known contamination? Any illicit activities occurring on the site? The applicant doesn't select priority brownfield sites that best make the application's case. Again, you want to grab sites that have data associated with them that shows these areas in the most impoverished light possible. The applicant lists too many priority sites. So for coalition sites, you have to list, I believe, at least 3 is the number. If it's not 3, it's 5. But for the other sites, you don't want to list at more than 3 or 4. It just becomes too much. So pick 3 or 4 of your worst sites and highlight those in the application. You only have 10 pages for these grant applications, so you don't want to eat up a ton of space by feeling like, well, let me put in 10. It's quantity over quality. Go for the quality, find the worst sites, and those are the ones that you should target. Identifying additional sites. Some of the common mistakes here that the applicant doesn't describe what process is going to be employed to identify and prioritize additional sites to expend funding on. So if you go for a multi-purpose or an assessment grant and you've highlighted some priority sites, issues may come up where you either aren't granted access to that site or some other problem comes up and you have to start looking at other sites. You want to make sure that you have a process in place that will explain how those sites will be identified. Another problem we see is that the applicant doesn't discuss who's actually going to do that prioritization. You want to make sure that you have a core group, whether it be a brownfields task force. You want to make sure that the public, the community is involved in this process. A lot of times they know where those brownfield sites are. They know what the history is. Some people, members of the community may have worked on those sites when they were active. So they have a good familiarity. So again, you want to make sure who's going to be part of this process. Next up, we're still in section 1. is revitalization of the target area, the reuse strategy in alignment with revitalization plans. Some of the problems we see here is that the applicant doesn't discuss how identified plans specifically pertain to priority brownfield sites or a target area. They just scramble, they grab a plan. Well, this is the master plan for our town, but it really doesn't have any relevance to the target area or your priority sites, so we include it anyway. You want to make sure that it relates to your application and your target sites and target areas. The applicant doesn't discuss other plans that are relevant. Sometimes you have to, you think beyond, again, the bounds of maybe your community. Are there any transportation projects that may be scheduled to occur that may have a huge impact on the redevelopment of that site and access, and which also would help define what a potential reuse for that site might be. Under outcomes and benefits of the reuse strategy, under here the applicant confuses outputs with outcomes. So outcomes and benefits, examples of that would be, acres of open space, new jobs created, square footage of office or retail. That is basically an outcome. So you want to make sure that you understand the difference between the two. An output would be if you have an assessment grant, it would be, we're going to conduct 4 phase 2s and 2 phase 1s. That's an output. Outcomes, again, is what's going to result of this whole effort. Under strategy for leveraging resources needed for site reuse, the applicants typically, problem here is that applicants don't delineate between potential future resources and secured resources. You want to make that clear in your application. What are you anticipating going after, and what do you actually have secured? The applicants also don't relate funding resources to the appropriate phase of the project. That's where this all comes back to having good planning and having a good blueprint to move forward with your project. If you know what all the project elements are through the course of your project, you know where to apply particular funding that may be applicable only to that phase. So you want to make sure that you're clear on that. Use of existing infrastructure. Problem here is that the applicant forgets to mention infrastructure that provides access to the site. Again, roadways, rail, water, mass transit. The applicant forgets to mention required infrastructure upgrades. So you may have a property that either doesn't have infrastructure, or the infrastructure that it does serve the site is dated and needs to be upgraded. You want to make sure that you're clear in listing that in your application. So moving on to section 2, community need and community engagement. Community need, the community's need for funding. Applicant forgets to mention burdens to the entity's budget that prohibit funding the project on their own. So that could be, climate change events, hurricanes, flooding, policing vacant sites that, have illicit activities going on in them, could be a strain on a budget. So think about, what does this, what burdens does your community have to endure that really puts pressure on the budget, and that's why you can't fund it on your own, and you need to come in for EPA fundings or funds. Threats to sensitive populations. Problem here is that the applicant doesn't quantify statements regarding health and census data. I mentioned this several times before. You just can't say we have a high incidence of heart disease and cancer. You have to find the numbers that support that statement. Health or welfare of sensitive populations, or greater than normal incidence of disease and adverse health conditions. The applicant forgets to discuss exposure pathways related to the priority sites. I mean, it doesn't have to be something that you know for sure, but if you have a high, if you have a site that's suspected to be contaminated with carcinogens, and you have a population that's suffering from an inflated rate of cancer, I think you can roughly assume that's contributing on some level. So you want to make sure that you make those connections and discuss those exposure pathways, how that material may be coming into contact with the community. Under environmental justice, identification of environmental justice issues, advancing environmental justice. The applicants on those 2 sections, the applicants many times forget to mention how the project is actually going to remedy the threats and those EJ issues that you list. So make sure that that's covered. So continue on section 2, community engagement, project involvement. The problem here is that the applicant makes the mistake of going for quantity versus quality of partners. You don't want to just fill the page with everybody, and you have eight partners listed and 8 of them are doing community engagement. You want to make sure that you kind of diversify what roles they're going to play. To make, so that you're not, stacking the deck with just community engagement. You want to make sure that you have a diverse kind of set of resources that these partners are going to bring. Again, project roles, I just covered that. There's a redundancy in what that's going to be. Incorporating community input. Applicants discuss the community input as a necessary requirement instead of a meaningful, and how the garnered input will be considered in the project. So again, community engagement is extremely important. It should be done early and often, and it should be done meaningfully. So that means you don't want to do it just to say you check the box. You want to make sure that it's a critical and vital part of the process. So moving on to section 3, which is task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. Under description of tasks, activities, and outputs, project implementation, anticipated project schedule, applicants include a schedule that is unrealistic and or out of sequential order for the tasks that they list in their application. And again, section 3 that I'm covering now and section 4, these are the pro forma sections where you basically, you answer the question that's asked of you in the guidelines or the application criteria. Under task, activity, lead, and outputs, under outputs, applicants confuse outputs and outcomes. Again, I covered that earlier. Outputs would be the number of phase 1 or phase 2s you're going to do. Outcomes would be the number of jobs it creates, square footage of retail space, acres of open space. Cost estimates, the applicant doesn't include generated accurate costs. They back into a number. They don't check math. You wouldn't believe how many times this is an issue. Make sure you check your math. Make sure that you hand it to somebody else not involved and have them take a look at your numbers and make sure that they all add up correctly. Under plan to measure and evaluate environmental progress and results, some of the problems here are that the applicants don't include a project tracking method beyond acres. Acres is required as part of the grants, but you also want to make sure that you have some other system employed that's going to track the progress of your project. Another issue here is that applicants don't include a corrective action that you would employ if the project goes off track. So you need to come up with an effective mechanism to be able to get that project back on track and explain what that's going to be in your application. So section 4, the last section, which is programmatic capability and past performance. Under programmatic capability, under organizational capacity, organizational structure, here the applicants don't include a structure and description of how it will function. They list everybody that's going to be involved in the project. They list their expertise, but they don't really give a good feel for how this structure is going to interact and function throughout the life of the project. So we want to make sure you do that. Under description of key staff, then we go to acquiring additional resources. Under here, applicants forget to reference in accordance with 2 CFR Part 200 or higher procurement standard. That is how you will basically acquire additional resources. So you want to make sure that you're complying with the federal requirement. You simply need to just make that statement. Unless you're operating in a state or a municipality where that standard is actually higher than what the federal government requires. Continued on section 4, past performance and accomplishments. Applicants they forget to consider the or option. There's going to be 3 options for you here. You've had an EPA federal grant, you've had another significantly sized grant, or you've never had any grants. You can't just say, well, none of this doesn't apply. You have to follow that or option and answer the one that applies to your set of circumstances. Moving down the list, that we don't see too many problems under subsection 1 and 2, but under 3, never receive any type of federal, non-federal assistance agreements. Again, The applicants here forget to list accomplishments and compliance. You want to make sure that this is where you really toot your horn as to how you've managed these grants. You want to make sure that you list that and that you have complied with all those grant requirements. And you don't discuss, an applicant forgets to discuss what the applied corrective measures of a project were if it went off track. Sometimes it just happens where a project goes off schedule for some reason. That's okay. It doesn't necessarily kill your chances of being funded. You just want to make sure that you list here what that corrective action is that you applied and that it was successful and that you were eventually able to meet the requirements of the grant. So quick, last thing, helpful tips that we always cover. Make sure that you read the guidelines and the resource materials thoroughly. EPA has provided a ton of free resources that you can utilize in preparing your grant applications. Of course, NJIT TAB, if you're in regions 2 and 4, is a free resource. We are the only ones you're going to be able to talk to after the guidelines come out, because once that happens, EPA goes silent. They have to. They're not allowed to, other than answering eligibility questions, they can't really help you with the grant application at all. We can. That's why we're an independent resource. So make sure that you have a good understanding of what's available to you and read those guidelines. You want to follow the guideline outline similar to what I had just listed and going through those common mistakes. Don't get creative. Don't renumber them. Do it exactly the way they provide it in the guidelines, because you want it to be as easy as possible for your grant reviewer to follow through in their review and know what they're looking at and keep them happy, because a happy grant reviewer is a generous one, and these grants really can be lost by 2 or 3 points. You want to use tables when appropriate. It saves space. It also shows the dating in a really compelling manner to help make your case. You do not want to include any maps or photos in the application. You don't want to skip questions because you don't have information or data. If you don't have that information or data, explain why you don't have it. You just can't ignore it and move on to the next question. You have to address it in some manner. Do not add hyperlinks or data or other information. No reviewer is going to click on a hyperlink because you said this hyperlink shows you an elevated cancer risk. They're not going to go off that hyperlink. So don't include them in the application. You want to get one person to edit the application. Many times these applications are put together by multiple people. Get one editor to look at the whole application so that they can make sure that it reads fluently and relates well from section to section. You want to get someone who knows nothing about the project to review the application, which in some cases will be somebody from EPA's review team. They're not going to know they won't even be from the region that you're located in. So if you give this to somebody who has no knowledge of the project and they start having questions for you, chances are that you didn't answer those questions adequately. Lastly, if you hire a consultant, you want to make sure that they tell the story you want told. Don't let them run with it. Make sure that they're expressing what your needs are with the application. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. What you can do now is if you have questions, put them into the Q&A. While you're doing that, I'm going to turn it back over to Fatima, who is going to go over some upcoming events with you, and then we'll get to addressing the questions that you've submitted. So Fatima, actually, before it goes to Fatima, this is my contact information. Fatima is also going to have this, our contact information for our hotline for TAB listed at the end on the last slide for you to contact us should you have any questions about either today's webinar or you need assistance with your grant application. Okay, Fatima, it's all you.
Great. Thank you, Sean. I definitely feel more prepared. I'm not personally putting in a grant, but I almost feel like a Girl Scout at this point. Like I am fully prepared to put one in now. So thank you for that useful information. Especially I loved your talk about your brownfield partners. You definitely want to get, I feel like it's a year-round thing outside of the grant application season. You always want to be able to partner with your community to really strengthen your goals and make sure these things get done. Anyway, so yes, should anyone present today have any additional questions or comments after this webinar ends, feel free to utilize our post-webinar survey or connect with us on the NJIT TAB LinkedIn page. You may also visit our website at www.njit.edu/tab or other social media platforms to access more information, resources, and news. And as Sean said, speaking of news, while we wait for folks to type in their questions and comments, I'd like to speak about some upcoming events that you may be interested in, as well as some of our past events that you're able to see recordings of. First up, on June 20th, we have the City of Memphis and Shelby County CRA June Brownfield Coalition meeting. This will be a virtual session. On June 24th through the 26th, we have the Mississippi Municipal League 93rd Annual Conference in Biloxi, Mississippi. On June 26th through the 28th, 2024, Florida Brownfields Association Annual Conference in Gainesville, Florida. We'll be posting the links to look at more information for this event as well in the chat, so don't worry about that if you miss it. If you could go to the next slide. There we go. On July 10th, 2024, we'll also be at we'll be hosting a Brownfield Inventory Workshop in Cooperstown, New York. July 10th, we'll be doing a Catawba Regional Council of Governments. We're doing a virtual workshop on navigating the Brownfield redevelopment process. And on July 23rd, with the Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky, we'll be doing a consultant procurement webinar. It'll be a virtual webinar. All this to say is that TAB is on tour. If you'd like NJIT TAB to visit your area, feel free to contact us. Sean gave his contact information. You may also, again, visit us on our website at www.njit.edu/tab. If you could click the next slide. All that to say, hopefully we can meet you all in person. If you're not local to these events, we'd love to, again, come visit you. My apologies. We could actually provide a multitude of services at no cost, from one-on-one technical assistance to in-person events such as our Brownfield Basics Workshop. If you're interested, feel free to reach out. Our social media information will be shown after this slide. Be sure to connect with us for news and to know if we'll be in your area. For those that can't make it to any of our events, either webinar or in person, and would like to access this webinar after today, again, as I said earlier, we post our recordings along with presentations and related resources and links on our website. Again, njit.edu/tab/webinars. Today, we've highlighted 3 for you that you might complement your grant application journey. First up, we have Pop-Up Progress, Unveiling the Magic of Temporary Brownfield Makeovers, with NJIT TAB's Director of Environmental Services, Kaylin Bruno. In this webinar, she'll explore how temporary usage of brownfields could spark community and stakeholder interest into developing sites into permanent community fixtures. Next, with Brownfields a Story to Tell, with our Brownfield redevelopment specialist, Elise Muller, she's going to explore how storytelling can enrich and strengthen your grant application while telling the unique story of your community. Definitely check that one out if you're in the middle of when you're doing your grant writing. Lastly, Brownfield Contaminants and Human Health, with our Brownfield redevelopment specialist, Joseph M. Reiner. In this webinar, he explores how brownfield contaminants can impact a community's health outcomes and how there are tools available to investigate those contaminants on a local level to help spread awareness and initiate positive changes in your community. Earlier, Sean said that sometimes folks forget to put in their grant applications how the different exposure pathways. Definitely check this one out if you want to learn more about that. Again, feel free to view those recordings after today's webinar or explore the NJIT TAB website to find a vast library of resources, links, and other informative videos. All right, if you could go to the next slide. And with that information out of the way, let's see what questions and comments we have for us today. I think we have a few in our, let me just go up on the chat. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab. I know we have some folks who put it in the chat, so I could just scroll back. That's not a problem. Let me just go back. All right, so we have our first question from Matt Schumann. If you'd like to go on speaker, feel free to raise your hand in the chat, or I could just say that question for you. Oh, I think you are raising your hand. Yes, okay.
Yeah, I'm not Matt Schuman. Schuneman. That's my colleague. For some reason, my name is showing up as his. This is Mariah Matheson. Um, I registered as my own name, but for some reason, my name is showing up as his. Um, yeah, my first question was with regard to target areas. So I guess this was before you, the speaker, presenter was saying, no, you should not include any kind of mapping. But with regard to target areas, how specific do you need to get? So you don't need to include any kind of, information on boundaries or numbers of numerical numbers on plat mapping, of information of that nature. That was my question.
Yeah, no, what you need to do is, and that's a great question. And like I said, some people do struggle with this. You basically say it's bounded on the north by Main Street, to the left by the, Willamette River, and to the west on the Willamette River, and then to the right by the, so-and-so rail yards, and to the south by Maple Street. That's basically what you need to. You just can't say the northwest quadrant of so-and-so city. You want to make sure that you're using bounds so that they have an understanding.
So you want to be specific on, say, street names or perhaps geographical boundaries. So if there's some sort of lake or some sort of natural boundary, that's what you would describe.
Correct.
Okay.
Perfect. I believe you also had another question as well, further in the chat. Would you like to ask that one as well?
Sure. And so you were saying something about infrastructure. So you, on one hand, you said make your application as look as bad as possible. Well, not as, but make your project look as, you want to make it look as needy as possible. But with regard to infrastructure, do you want to prioritize more available infrastructure? Is it, or is that the priority?
That question really isn't part so much of establishing community need. That's more for EPA to get a feel for what other resources are going to be needed to get that site up and ready for redevelopment. You're not really establishing need through the lack of that. That's something that that's something that you might repeat in the community needs section of the application, stating that, there's no Wi-Fi, we don't have any mass transit options in this community. But as far as the site itself, they want to know, does it have gas, electric, water, sewer? If not, what upgrades needed to be made, and how is that going to be done? Because that's something that you can't do with brownfields funding. So it's basically for them to have give EPA reviewer a good handle on what is going to be needed to get this site up and redeveloped, and whether or not you've accounted for those costs along the way.
I see. So whether or not if there are other infrastructure needs and how you're going to pay for that.
Correct.
If those,
yeah, I mean, they're not gonna score you higher because you don't have access, because it looks worse that that's community need because you don't have this kind of infrastructure. You're not going to get any points more or less for that, or you're not going to get less points because you do have a good upgraded infrastructure.
Okay.
It may help you only in the fact that where you could say the community has already upgraded the infrastructure in this area in anticipation of redeveloping that site. Again, that's going to feed into their desire to see that there's been some planning and that there's been investment in this site being redeveloped.
Okay, thank you. That was all I had. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Perfect. Thank you, Mariah, for joining us and for your questions. All right, we have another one. The next one is from Arisa Brandeo. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing individuals' names. If you'd like to be unmuted and ask your question, feel free to do so now. I see that you were given the option to do so. If not, I could post your question. I could speak your question as well. Okay. It looks like I will speak it then. Are those registrations for state/federal grant applicants only? Are contractors included? Are you referring to the Grants.gov and the UEI? Correct me if I'm wrong. Registrations?
I'll assume,
Yes. Yes.
oh yeah, that is strictly for federal funds. Not state funding. State funding is a whole different process, depending on the state that you're located within.
Great, thank you. Let's see.
Fatima, it might be easier if you read them just in the interest of time.
Yeah, not a problem. We could do
Sure.
that. Totally fine. All right, we have a question from Luann. Can a cleanup grant be applied for that is a state property in our township if you have approvals from the state and our township committee?
Absolutely, as long as the site is eligible and the applicant isn't the responsible party, meaning that they're not responsible for the contamination on the site. But again, any eligibility is, I can tell you what my impression would be on certain things, but you always want to go to your EPA regional office and get confirmation that your site is eligible prior to going through this whole process.
Great, thanks. Good to know. All right, Luann asks another question as well. Can you mention the CFR requirement again? I believe she came a little bit late. I don't know if it's something she missed or.
It's CFR, let's go back. It's CFR 200 part, oh, there we go. 2 CFR part 200. That's basically the federal procurement standard that has to be met.
Great, thank you. And then I see Luann did ask if you'll share your PowerPoint. We're going to share that on our website. After this webinar, as registered attendees, you'd be able to be notified when the recording, as well as any presentations or any additional information will be posted on our website. But feel free to check back at any point. It's a really useful website. Hello. It's a very useful website where you can find tons of resources and information. Great. I think that's all of the questions. I'm seeing in the chat. Let me just confirm with the Q&A. I think that's all we have for today. If I missed a question in the chat, quickly raise your hand, but I think that's everything. Yep. Okay, great. So now that everything's done, and with that, again, we thank you for spending some time with us today, and I hope you all have a great day. And may luck favor all of those that prepared with us today. Bye.